I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Well, Bill, the Associated Press is reporting the results of a new study that says that the elderly, and specifically elderly conservatives, are much more likely to share fake news on the internet than younger people are, or than people of less extreme political views, let's say. And let me give you a little bit of data from this study just for context. On average, first of all, this is good news. On average, only 8.5% of people studied, about 1 out of 12 people, shared false information during the 2016 presidential campaign. So it's actually a relatively small percentage of people. However, average person older than 65 of those who did share false information shared 7 times more false information than those 18 to 29. And let's see where's here we go. Very conservatives shared, people who classified themselves as very conservative shared misinformation 6.8 times more often than very liberal people, and 6.7 times more often than moderates. And people who called themselves liberals essentially shared no fake stories. Now, they grant the last part of that. It may have to do with the fact that the presidential election was underway and Donald Trump was the lightning rod that he was. But Bill, this concerns me. I mean, we are conservative to very conservative. I am, approaching the age that triggered where the trigger point was on that study. Is one of the scientists who did this study correct when he says the problem is that the elderly people don't have digital literacy? They don't understand that things are fake.
Well, if I understand his study correctly, he's not saying elderly people. He's saying elderly conservatives. He's saying elderly liberals don't share any false news at all. I find that immediately to be extremely suspicious. I suspect that one of the embedded problems in these numbers is the selection bias on the part of the person doing the study in terms of what's actually false news. In other words, anything that conservatives spread that a liberal thinks is false news. Anything that a liberal spreads that a liberal thinks is false is true news. You know what I mean? It's until we have a definition of false news and until we have a definition of what factually was shared, I'm not convinced about this story. But I do think, however, that there's probably something here. And the reason I think that conservatives, and especially elderly conservatives, share more false news is because they're better people. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. My mom, many years ago, I want to say 10, 15 years ago now, made a couple of donations to a fireman's fund and a wounded warriors fund. And so these donation letters started to come in hot and heavy, and she was, starting to peel off a significant amount of money for this thing, because while her initial contributions were for veterans and firefighters, what started coming back were letters that said, you've reached a contribution level where you're this close to this reward, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. And so needless to say, after seeing 3 or 4 of these things and hundreds, if not thousands of dollars of my mom's limited resources going out the door to what she thought were legitimate causes, I took a couple of these envelopes and I did something pretty simple, really. I just compared the addresses and the zip codes from these various separate so-called foundations. And they were all coming from the same place. And I confronted her with this, and she could not believe that somebody would lie about something like that. She simply couldn't process it. And to that degree, I suspect that fundamental honesty is one of the main reasons that this happens. I think that the selection bias is in there in the study, but I also think that we certainly have less cynical people, I would say. Older people are less cynical than younger people, and conservatives tend to be less cynical than progressives. So if it turns out that means gullibility, and it very well likely does, then that's the kind of gullibility that I would not only tolerate, but wish we had a little more of.
Do you think we grew up in an age, or people who are over 65 anyway, grew up in an age when something appeared in print, it was given the benefit of the doubt as to being true, and when something was on the news, it was assumed that it was being reported in a fair way, and now we're in a much more skeptical age, even if that never was true of journalism? Do you think there was that expectation, and that has colored the minds of people who grew up during that time?
There's no question about it. There's no question about it that in the 40s and 50s, just take an example of the formative years of an older generation today. first of all, you're coming out of the Depression and the war, and these are searing experiences, and you need the sense that somebody's telling you the truth. You've got two existential crises back to back, and these were the days where I guess it was FDR was in an election, one of his four. I want to say it was maybe the 40 election. It was probably the 44 election. Almost certainly it was. And there was some kind of state secret or something that the Republican opponent, I don't remember the details of this, was kind of dancing around. And basically, the president called his Republican opponent into the White House and said, this is what's going on with the war. And just as a gentleman's agreement, they said they're not going to talk about it anymore. There were cases where the press wouldn't talk about FDR's incapacity due to polio out of just respect for the people. So there's no question that if you grow up on Jimmy Stewart and It's a Wonderful Life, you're going to have a different value system than if you grow up on Peter Griffin and Family Guy. I mean, there's just no question about it. And this is why I'm railing against the decline of the pop cultures, because all of this stuff goes downstream and it affects how we vote. I'm sure that the false news stories, fake news stories that people shared were stories that appeared to be believably true. And not being of that age, I have come to realize that if there's a story that seems to be too good to be true in terms of political angle, then it is almost certainly not true.
Now,
Walking on these landmines is something that scares the living daylights out of me.
And I'll restate that this is a very small percentage of the public in any case that are sharing these fake news. So this is a small subset of a very small subset. But that said, there's a Harvard professor who basically said it's not digital illiteracy on the part of older people. It's the fact that they are using this sharing activity as a way to signal their political affiliation or to signal their beliefs. And maybe they don't probe too deep into the stories at all. They see a headline and a lead sentence that reinforces something they already believe. And they say, yeah, darn right, get it out there.
Well, I don't know if that's fair to them either. The world is changing so fast, and it's such a challenge for me constantly, certainly, to keep my ear to the ground. I live listening mostly in the last year or two. Almost all of the video content that I take in is from 18 to 23-year-old gamers. I'm really interested in what they're doing and what they're thinking, and so I'm trying to keep my ear to the ground. With a world that changes so quickly, in a world that becomes ever more complex technologically, and in terms of the politics of everything, it's not unreasonable to assume that an older person wouldn't have the just basically the knowledge database to be able to sniff out obvious inaccuracies. But again, I don't think that's really the issue. I think the issue is that they're very, generally speaking, trusting people. And I can remember so clearly just the look on my mom's face of it was a sense of, first of all, it was revulsion, and then it was a sense of like deep disappointment and then disbelief. The idea that somebody would be stealing money from old people in the name of veterans and firefighters, she simply couldn't believe it. She could not believe it. And that's not something that's not a battle I wanted to, I don't want to die on that hill, proving to her that this was true. So I just let it go. There's a fundamental honesty about people, about many people, where where the idea of things that we talked about in an earlier show, like this false flag thing in Arizona, where a candidate was accused of Alabama, wanted to take the whole state dry. Wasn't true. He never believed it, never said it. It's just a political campaign to smear the guy and cost him the election. There are people in this country, and I certainly by nature am one of them, just in terms of the way I'm inclined, to simply not credit that people could be that miserable and low. But they are. And so one of the tactics to discredit any side is to give them a story that they pass around with glee and then have it turn out to be false, because then you can use that example to discredit everything else they believe. And that's kind of like what this study is doing, I think. But again, I wouldn't call any of this breaking news. Nothing would make me happier. Nothing would make me happier than to find out that we were considered, my generation and the generation below us, were considered to be overly cynical by a much more trusting and much more honest young generation.
Bill, you hardly want to say to people, don't believe anything you read. I mean, there was an old expression, don't believe anything you hear and half of what you read, or something like that my grandfather used to say.
Don't trust anybody over 30.
Yeah, that too. But you don't want to say to people, don't believe anything you read unless you have time to do the research, because who has time to do the research? You should have, we used to depend on the reporters to cross-check the sources. And now basically, with information you see on the internet, unless you get 2 or 3 sources that corroborate that are reliable, how would you even bother reading the news at all? It seems like it's all a game. I might as well read fiction novels.
You're saying the number was like 6 or 7%?
Well, it was like 8.5% of people who were sharing fake news stories.
Okay.
But there are a lot of fake news stories out there.
So what that basically says is that 91% of the shares are accurate.
Or at least people who are not sharing, 91% of people are not sharing fake news stories. Yeah.
Okay. It's not a bad number. 91%. It's not a bad number. That's higher than any candidate's ever pulled in this country's history for national office. 91%, not even close. An election is usually 52-48 on a blowout. So 91% accuracy is not something that I am too terribly worried about. And I'd be willing to bet you, look, I'm not trying to say this isn't a problem, and I'm not trying to say that it's okay that false news stories emphasize a position that's incorrect. That's a real problem, and something we should be alert to, and something we should try to look into. At the very least, you can Google it. But then again, Scott, so let's say you get a false news story and you Google it and you go to Snopes. And you find that Snopes is paid for by George Soros. You find out that it is absolutely the most biased source. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to Snopes and had them claim a claim was false because they didn't intend it to be true, or just it's amazing how much, if you really have an analytical mind for information and dissecting how people's language works, you'd be astonished at the kind of gymnastics that Snopes goes through. Presumably, as it's a brilliant idea if you think about it. We're going to have a website that's going to be the arbiter of truth, and we're going to own that website, and we're going to tell them what we think is true and what isn't true, and it'll further reinforce things. So we don't want to be dependent on false news for our worldview. The entire theory of conservatism is to try to get an idea of how the world really is, and then use these timeless principles to find the best path, not necessarily a good path, just hopefully the best path through these reefs that we encounter every day in life. So yes, I would say be careful. And I would say if it seems really incredible, then, chances are it's not true. But when you find out how much is true, and you find out the level to which Scott, if you had told me 10 years ago that the president and the secretary of state were seriously sharing national security secrets on open servers, and that the attorney general who was looking into this case met with the husband of one of the secretary of state who was the prime subject of the investigation, and they met on a runway and they got into an airplane and all they talked about was their grandchildren. If you told me that, I would have said, this is a conspiracy. It's obviously a lie. There's no way that could be true. No way.
If you read enough news, you'll probably assume that there are no disinterested parties. And one of the things that we're very clear about here at Bill Whittle Now and at BillWhittle.com in general is that we are not disinterested parties. We definitely have a point of view. We're open about stating it, and we never try to sneak something in on you by being someone we're not. People who appreciate that have actually joined up and become members at BillWhittle.com because they want to advance these ideas very openly, and we do so through their membership dollars that they contribute when they go to BillWhittle.com and click the Become a Member link. 5 days a week, Bill brings you his cogent analysis of the daily news, and he's right out there with the truth and his principles and values, and we know you appreciate that. So, to the members at BillWhittle.com, thank you very much. From Bill Whittle and Scott Ott.